Warning: the podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast. Hello, I am Wendy.
And I'm David.
And we are the Murder Police Podcast.
Well, welcome aboard, listeners. We thought we'd stop and get everybody caught up to date a little bit. We're closing out Season 2, and we're starting to get things ready for Season 3 and the seasons that are going to follow. And we thought we'd recap with everybody. And more importantly, we'd like to give everybody a huge thanks for the listeners that we have that have got us where we are and where we're going. We're extremely grateful, and the movement we've had on this thing is completely unexpected.
Yeah, I never expected when we had the idea, or you had the idea to do this podcast, that we would have as many dedicated listeners as we have today, and we are really grateful for that. So thank you for tuning in every time we drop a new episode and listening to us. That does mean a lot to us, and it means a lot to spread the stories of these victims that are the reason that we're here today.
Yeah, I agree. The following is incredible. And I think what really took me by surprise was how global it is. I know we have listeners here in the United States, and there's a lot of logic to that. And of course, Great Britain, I guess I could see that too. But holy cow, we are all over the place. Of course, Ireland, which has a special place in my heart, and people need to message us because that's where my family came from a long, long time ago. But then things like India, Spain, Kazakhstan, the Netherlands, France, Ukraine, and Denmark. And what are some of the other countries you've seen so far?
Oh, Lord, Zimbabwe, Belgium even, and South Africa, and Egypt, Indonesia, India, Mexico. And I know my dedicated friend down in Jamaica, Greg Connell. Thank you for listening, Greg, and I hope you're sharing with your friends.
Yeah, for sure. Greg's a good guy, and I'm sure he's helping. And that's one thing, too, we found is that I think most of our growth can be attributed to people simply recommending this to other people. So we're super grateful for that. Super grateful. But inside the United States, too, if we start looking at the different cities, and I've got a list of cities here we're looking at. Not all of them are in the United States. For example, we know that Blackheath and places like that, Dublin, and those are not in the United States, but wow, I keep looking at Atlanta, Georgia. How we got into Atlanta and the follower-ship we have in Atlanta is incredible.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's much larger than it is here in our hometown of Lexington, which is where the majority of our retired sergeants and officers have come from, and you especially, right here in Lexington. But surprisingly, Atlanta is one of our biggest listeners. So thank you, Atlanta.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, here in Kentucky, the good, strong followership we've got in places like Richmond and Frankfort and Nicholasville, where we happen to be coming from live from Nick Vegas, and Georgetown, St. Matthews, just outside Louisville, all kinds of neat places. So I think that's one of the things that's neat is that the amount of people that are listening from all over. And I found out just about 2 weeks ago, too, that there's actually a person that teaches criminal justice in high school in the area, and she uses the Murder Police Podcast as an assignment when they're in semester, which just blew my mind. And we're very grateful for that too.
Yeah, listen up, students. We'll help you get an A on your next exam.
Exactly. We can only
contact
hope.
us.
Well, I'll tell you, when we started out, and we've divided these up into about a dozen or so per season, just for listening purposes and to break. And whenever we move into another season, there's maybe a small twist. I know we've done some different intro things and whatever, but just for management purposes, we're going to start into 3. But where we've been since we started, just some of the cases. For example, if you're listening to this and you have not downloaded all of our material, go back to these beginning ones. Don't skip episodes, because I'm going to tell you there's so much that happens in the chronology you don't want to miss. But tell us about the first thing we ever came out of the box with.
Well, the first one is my all-time favorite, always has been. I've been intrigued by this case since I heard about it, and strangely, it was a case that you started out working alongside retired detective Chris Schoonover, and that was the murder of Haley McCone right here in Lexington, 13-year-old little girl murdered by serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells, who since has been executed out of Texas. But that one is a 3-part series, and that was our very first one.
And I think Chris knocked it out of the park. And people hear from Chris more than once on this show, obviously. But the whole idea that how much time it took. And you know what's neat is this, like several others, have been covered in books and on documentaries and things. But I can honestly tell people that if you listen to it when we cover it, we're going to offer you more details because everything else is based on commercial time and editing and production and everything. But when you listen to an investigator talk about what it's like to do it, the Haley McCone case was a great one to come out of the gate with. You know, we moved quickly onto that one to the murder of Trent DeGiro. And that, again, was here in Lexington. And retired Sergeant Dan Gibbons covered that. Dan is one of a handful of true mentors that I had at the police department. He actually was instrumental in me starting in homicide many years ago. And the Trent DeGiro case is extremely tragic and sad. You're talking about a walk-on football player from University of Kentucky that was brutally murdered, sniper style, by a young man. And I'll let the listeners get those 2 episodes under their belt to find out what the results of that were. But Dan did a great job of taking people through what it was exactly like to see the investigation, but he also brings it in from a supervisor's point of view, which is a little different, to learn what the supervisor does in a homicide investigation.
Yeah, that was a very sad case, and we've seen his parents at a couple of events that we've attended over the years, and they are really, really great people, and that was such a tragic loss. And all of our victims are tragic losses to all their families, but you're right, Dan really took the listeners through that step by step and did a wonderful job. We moved on from the murder of Trent DeGiro right on to Michael Turpin, and this was another one that have books out about it. And it was also done by retired Assistant Chief Fran Root, who did an exceptional job of that. Fran really took it through from the minute he got that call all the way through to prosecution. And that was a horrendous murder of Michael Turpin by his wife and 2 other accomplices. And please listen to that. That's a 2-part series. And Michael was brutally murdered in his apartment and subsequently thrown into a lake to be found by employees the morning after he was murdered.
Yeah, and another thing, too, on the Michael Turpin case is that there's another podcast locally that we've partnered with recently, the Lexington podcast. It's a brother and sister duo, Erica and Jonathan. And at the time that we're recording this, they're still producing episodes on the Michael Turpin, well-researched. I would recommend, of course, we recommended everybody hearing ours, but I have to tell people, jump over and listen to the Lexington podcast version of that, and their material is fantastic. You know, from Michael Turpin, we moved on to another interesting case in the murder of Amanda Ross. And this was difficult in a lot of different ways because this was the first domestic violence murder that we covered. And those are extremely painful because the entire time somebody's going through a domestic violence event, which can last a long time from the time you identify a perpetrator to hopefully prosecution. This is one of those cases. And that was covered excellently by retired Sergeant Todd Iddings. And he takes the listener through what it's like to work with these, what it's like to get protective orders. And unfortunately, sometimes when those protective orders just aren't enough.
Yeah, and the surprising thing about that is we had a former governor by the name of Louis B. Nunn, and his son, Steve, who was a senator for Kentucky, is actually who murdered Amanda. And they were engaged and had been on again, off again. And so that was a high-profile case for Kentucky. Not that our other cases aren't, but just someone of such significance. And the crazy thing about that case was Steve Nunn had gone to bat to write some different bills passing for domestic violence, and he himself broke his own bill that he wrote. So there was some irony in that, I found.
Yeah, and for sure, when you listen to Todd talk about this, you said it was a high-profile case. I'm going to tell you now that as an investigator, if you get a case that has that kind of profile, the pressure is on, and pretty soon, if you listen to this, you'll find that detectives and investigators are dealing with a whole bunch of other stuff other than the case. So people need to listen to that to get a real interesting perspective on that. What'd you think of the next one with Chelsea Hayes? Tell us about that.
Oh, Chelsea Hayes. That was the first one that we went out of town to do. Our other cases, the aforementioned, were all Lexington cases. And the one after the one I'm about to talk about was a Lexington case as well. But Chelsea Hayes, we went to Chattanooga. We interviewed Lieutenant Daniel Francis, who did an exceptional job with this case. He really was so involved in this case and still is involved with some of the family members. Chelsea Hayes was a 14-year-old young lady who was murdered. And sadly, the person who murdered her propped her up on his front porch, and she was observed by neighbors, and the person who murdered her pretended to have no knowledge of her being on the porch or even knowing who she was. So that was a really sad case, in that it was another very young victim. Not that any of our victims, it isn't a sad case, but, we had a 13-year-old, and then we followed along with Chelsea Hayes, which was a 14-year-old victim. And Daniel just was exceptional in how he went through that case. I was so impressed. Not that our other local detectives aren't great, because they are, but Daniel, just the amount of heart and soul that he poured into that, and mentoring siblings after this murder. And I think he still today has contact with the younger boys.
Oh, for sure. And people have to tune into that, because again, that's what we offer, is that you're going to hear the emotional impact of what it's like to work these cases. Compared to what Hollywood and TV have told you about the police, it's completely different.
Yeah, I think Hollywood leads you to believe that you work the case and it's done and you move on to the next one. And while these men and ladies do have cases that pile on top of cases that pile on top of cases, it just isn't over for them when the case is solved. These people, they wear this on their sleeve. And a lot of these people who have dealt with this still, when you look back 20 years on these murders, they still get emotional at talking about how hard it was seeing those victims and working that case, and sleepless nights, and how still even now those cases bother them. So it's not, as Hollywood have you believe, that it's just they're done and they move on to the next one. These men and ladies, that sticks with them.
Oh, obviously. Yeah, it never goes away. I can drive through town now, and most of my landmarks I can ride through and say, well, I remember going to a case here, or a body was found here. It doesn't change. After that, we did something that I thought was neat. It was the first of hopefully many like this, but we actually had a 5-part mini-series on the murder of Indonesian-born Umi Southworth here in Lexington. And the treat on this was bringing in more than one detective at a time, and we brought in 3. And we had retired Detective Chris Schoonover, which we have had before. We had recently retired Detective Bill Brislin. This was his first one, did it great. And we had a current Lexington Police Lieutenant Dave Richardson on there. And what this delivered was, again, a lot of details about what it was like. But I'm going to tell you now, if people have not tuned in and downloaded these 5, they need to, because it really feels like you're in the homicide bay, because you're going to hear these people talk and toss ideas around and remind each other about this. And much to Bill's fate, they teased each other just as like real life, that humor that keeps them going on this. And you'll walk away from this thinking, poor Bill. Poor Bill.
Yeah, and this was a fun one. I know that these aren't supposed to be fun, but I'll tell you, sitting around the table with these 3 gentlemen, it was just fun. And there's a lot of outtakes that we didn't record, and a lot of laughter, and it was just a real fun setting. And there were so many details, again, like our other cases, that the listeners get to hear that just blow your mind. And Dave will go ahead and toot his horn on how creative he was in some things in this case to retrieve some evidence and do some tracking on some stuff. But that was a really fun 5-part miniseries. I enjoyed it.
Again, when people listen, it's not like we said, it's not the material itself isn't funny, but there's a camaraderie among investigators that actually helped them survive this. It's probably my experience in almost 30 years, that was the tightest team I ever worked with when I was in homicide, and that didn't get repeated later. So definitely people have to hear that. Talking about bizarre cases, what's that next one we covered?
Well, we went from 5 episodes in Umi Southworth to a 5-murder case worked by retired Assistant Chief Fran Root. This was a 2-part series on, 5 murders done by 2 females, LaFonda Faye Foster and Tina Powell. And that was a busy night for Mr. Fran Root. literally 5 people murdered in one night. It was a crazy case.
A genuine killing spree. So definitely people need to pay attention to that. On the next one we covered, we got to do another 4-part miniseries on a gentleman I met when I was teaching out of Kentucky last year. It's very interesting, very rare. People have to listen to this one to get the perspective. It's the murder of Bobby Jean Blacka in Kaiser, West Virginia. And the difference on this is that Bobby Jean, unfortunately, was addicted to drugs, opiates, heroin, and specifically, and died of an overdose. But because of Bobby McCone, who was the investigator in the case, because of his diligence, I think it was 4 people were charged with her murder.
Yeah, they were charged with her murder. And that was a first for us because that's a hot topic. And I think you posed it to our listeners of, if someone dies from an overdose, should the person that supplied that drugs be charged with that murder? And I think for the most part, most of our listeners that tuned in said, yes, they should. So this takes us a 4-part series through that. And again, Bobby McCone, the retired detective who worked that, that was his little hometown. And that's just a little spot on the maps, all that little place was. And, talk about reliving that and having to live it driving through there, in these teeny towns where he worked. Not only was he the only officer that patrolled the streets, he was the homicide detective. Crimes against children, he did it all. It was such a small department. But he had to see those people daily because that was his hometown. And, he arrested these people and charged them with her murder. And so that was a unique case too, just because of the sheer size of that little town he was from.
Very rare. Those are very difficult cases to make, to move that, because you have the part of the volunteer aspect of using a drug like that. But in this case, he was very successful in getting people in prison for that. Then we wrapped up, you talk about rare and interesting, we wrapped up season 2 while we're talking tonight with a 2-part series on the murder of Clay Nelson here in Lexington, Kentucky in 1986. And bizarre. People really need to listen to both episodes, because this is a case and, it's out, but I'm not going to give it all away. I'm just going to tell you to listen to it, because there's actually one of the most rare things you'll ever see is when the victim actually sends a message as Fran Root, who was the assistant.
Yes, our Fran Root came back again.
Exactly. And he did this. And as he said, the victim actually more or less testified from the grave. And I'm going to leave it at that. But it's a way to remember a guy named Clay Nelson, also known as Pally, from Richmond, Kentucky, which is a neighboring city from here, a very beloved man from Richmond, Kentucky. And this is a way to not let his memory die of who he was and that he mattered.
Well, and the neat thing about this is we brought on the Lexington podcast, Erica and Jonathan again, and they sat in with us on that, and they got to talk to Fran and ask questions. And it was kind of neat because they had done an episode on Michael Turpin, which Fran worked. So it was really neat that they got to meet Fran. I think that would have been kind of a neat thing, getting to meet somebody that you've talked about. It was almost like Fran was kind of a movie star. And well, Fran, if you're listening, we think you are anyway. So, but that was a really neat case. Manager of a restaurant. And as Fran said, he basically testified from the grave. And so that's a 2-part series that you won't want to miss either.
For sure. And Eric and Jonathan actually just did great. I can't think of another way to put it, but very insightful, very intuitive. They took the case deep, and there was a good chemistry in the room. And that kind of alludes me to what could be coming too that we're considering. And so that's where we were on season 1 and 2. If you haven't listened to any of those or all of them, then when you're done with this one, go back on your app and hit that checkbox and download all of them and get caught up, because you're going to meet people more and more that we repeat on these, and you'll get an idea of how they present a case. And so coming up, starting with season 3 that'll release in 2 weeks, is that what people can expect is there's going to be more fantastic cases from different locations, is that we are always procuring, just because you haven't seen them yet. We have a huge queue of things coming out, more in Tennessee, some in Virginia, Miami, Florida. I just got back from the Boston area, and I've got some interesting stuff that I think we're going to try to get unsolved up there. So there's tons of cases, and many more from here in our local area, obviously, because those are easy to get hold of. So they're on their way too. We're also going to kind of venture into the world of the unsolved and suspicious missing person cases coming up soon. those are going to be interesting. Hopefully we can move the ball forward on maybe getting information for these surviving families to clear these, but they're going to be an opportunity for family members to talk about who they lost or who's missing so that people can get that emotional connection with these people and remind everybody that we've got to get those cases laid down. We're also going to kind of mix in some other neat stuff, and you're going to have to listen to this to really get the full impact. We're going to continue to interview different people, though, as far as what their role is in the system and what it's like to do it. For example, prosecutors, defense attorneys, forensic specialists, medical examiners, people who have been jury members on murder trials, which is going to be interesting to hear their perspective. Private investigators. I've got a connection with a guy in this area that is a former police officer up north, but he actually pro bono picks up these adult missing cases on things where we really believe that foul play is at hand with some people. Interesting guy. We'll do an introductory thing, and then he's going to take us through a bunch of these. And then I've got some cold case detective work coming up too. Yeah, we'll get into some pretty good stuff too. And coming back to our experience with Aaron Jonathan is I really want to work on opportunities for the listeners, whoever's interested, to maybe dial in and take part in producing one of these shows, which I think would be neat. So if you're a true crime fanatic and you're a Murder Police podcast fan, we're going to start making some opportunities available if your schedule allows to work you into dialing in while we're doing an interview to feel free to ask some questions as you go through this listening to these investigators. And then lastly, something that I've been working on for a while and we're going to finally get to happen this summer is on our show notes, we're going to add show transcripts, which is a different way to do this, especially if somebody's hearing impaired or they want to go back and look and read along, but we're actually going to have dialogue transcripts loaded up, and that'll be interesting to help people out too. I'll tell you what, if people have ideas, suggestions, or comments, Wendy, what's the best way for them to get hold of us?
Well, they can email us at murderpolicepod@gmail.com. They also can reach out to us on our webpage and our social media platforms.
Yeah, the webpage is murderpolicepodcast.com. Handy. It's got show notes. It's got, whenever we release an episode, you'll see some graphics and some pictures from a case and whatever. Another thing, too, is that since we're going to move in this direction, if somebody has an unsolved case or a suspicious missing person case, we'd like to hear from you to start looking at the idea of maybe presenting that on the show. The one thing we'll need to do, though, for sure, is that when we do this is we have to have access to an assigned investigator. And that's pretty easy to do, and we'll make sure that they're comfortable with coming on the air because we're good about protecting the record and everything. But for sure, that's the whole premise of our show is people that do this work. So that'll be something we're looking for too. And the other thing too is that if you're listening to our episodes and you listen and you say, I knew that person or I went to high school with that person, give us a buzz too. We'd like to maybe talk to you about if we can add anything more on these episodes and especially on enhancing what these victims look like when they were alive. Because again, we're all about victim advocacy. If we can leave a good memory with them, that'd be fantastic too. And then last but not least is don't ever forget that we really appreciate when people talk to other people about our podcast and share it. That's been responsible for the success that we've had to date. And keep in mind that if people go to Apple Podcast and leave 5 stars and leave a review that talks about liking the show or whatever, just email us and let us know when you did it, and we will be happy to send you some of the Murder Police podcast swag that's always just limited availability right now. That's coffee mugs, pocket knives, notebooks, pens, things like that, as we've got a bunch of that stuff that we are really willing to express our gratitude for a good review on Apple and send to them.
Yes, so please give us 5 stars if you love our show and a good review. And with that, thank you again for tuning in to our Season 1 and our Season 2. And we are so excited about what Season 3 is going to hold.
Great things are coming. Take care. And again, thank you for the listenership. We appreciate it. The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, which is our website, and it has show notes for imagery and audio and video files related to the cases you're going to hear. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and YouTube, which has closed caption available for those that are hearing impaired. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. Subscribe to the Murder Police Podcast and set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.